Boa tarde, gente boa. My Portuguese, I am afraid, is not good enough to do this in anything but English, so I will apologize both to you and to the translators in advance. As you heard in that very kind introduction, I've written a book about social media called Here Comes Everybody, and I will save you the trouble of reading it by giving you the 5-word summary. Group action just got easier. The idea behind the book is that the internet, mobile phones, applications built on top of it, have made it dramatically much easier for groups of people to come together, find each other, share things, and get things done. And rather than talk about that in the abstract, I'd like to just tell a story that I think illustrates some of what's changed. So the story starts January of last year. A fundamentalist group in the Mangalore province in India called Sri Ram Sena, Lord Ram's army, it's a Hindu fundamentalist group, went out in the streets and attacked women who were drinking in public. And there was a video taken. Not only did they drag the women from the pub, they also were fighting with men who were trying to defend the women. And this was an attempt by Sri Ram Sena to enforce enforce their view of what the Hindu faith required of women living in society. The video, photos of the video were taken, and as is by now usual, became widespread on Flickr, on YouTube, on photo sharing services, video sharing services, and so forth. And it had the effect, this attack and the documentation had its desired effect, which is it made women afraid. And then one woman, Nisha Susan, decided she was going to do something about this. She thought that Sri Ram Sena's attack needed a response. And so she formed a Facebook group. And the Facebook group was called the Association of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women. And the membership in that group, as you might imagine, ballooned over the course of a couple of days, right? Thousands of people, mostly women, but thousands of people poured in and joined this group. And they announced the Pink Chadi campaign. Chadi is, Pink Chadi campaign, Happy Valentine's Day to Sri Ram Sena. One of Sri Ram Sena's targets is Valentine's Day, the idea being that anyone seen celebrating Valentine's Day is creating an affront to the Hindu religion, and women in particular, by celebrating Valentine's Day, are seen to align themselves with romantic notions which are not appropriate in Sri Ram Sena's view. And so in response to these threats of violence, the Association of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women said, this Valentine's Day we are going to send thousands of pairs of pink underwear to Sri Ram Sena. Sri Ram Sena, the joke buried in Hindu here is that Sri Ram Sena are often called chadi wearers, underwear wearers, because they wear khaki pants that look like large diapers. So the women here sent thousands of pairs of underwear to Sri Ram Sena in advance of Valentine's Day. This had a couple of different effects. The first and least important of the effects was on Sri Ram Sena themselves. They were obviously embarrassed, although they insisted that they were going to turn around and send appropriate Hindu dress to the women who sent the underwear, although they never actually did. The second, more important effect is that both India as a whole and the state of Mangalore became aware that there was a political constituency for making life safer for women. The sad truth of politics is we often expect politicians to do things because it would create a social good. But in fact, politicians often do things only when, or are spurred by, evidence of a large public group. And so by launching this campaign, not only were the women talking directly to Sri Ram Sena, they were also talking indirectly to the governments that were there to protect them. And the third effect it had was to give the women who participated a sense that they don't simply have to have the choice of going out and risking being attacked or staying home and surrendering their freedoms. There is a third choice. And that choice is now to use these kinds of tools. Tools like Facebook, tools like email, tools like mobile phones, to organize responses. Ordinarily, we would expect that Sri Ram Singh, an organization, could easily target women, not an organized group, and the women couldn't have an equivalently organized response. But what we see in this example is that in this case, when the women needed to organize, they had the tools to do it without having to be an organization in advance the way Singh is. And in recognition of this public protest, the Indian state actually clamped down on Singh, and there were no attacks on Valentine's Day. Singh had threatened to go out and attack anyone seen out in public in a romantic couple on Valentine's Day. And those attacks did not materialize, in part because Nisha Susan and the Association of News Forward and Homegrown Women had managed to communicate to the government how much this mattered. That change wasn't caused by these social tools, but it was enabled by them. And you have to be able to hold both of those senses in your mind at the same time. In the same way that the printing press didn't cause the Protestant Reformation, but the Protestant Reformation could not have happened without the printing press. Facebook did not cause the political protest in Bangalore, but the political protest in Bangalore could not have happened without Facebook. So there is this figure-8 loop between the media a society has and the uses society makes it do. Media makes new things possible, but it is social action that makes new things actual. So to make that same observation now on an absurdly grand historical canvas, we are living, and by that I mean our historical generation, is living through the largest increase in expressive capability in the history of the human race. And that's a big claim. I'm going to try and back it up. Oop. Sorry. You can give me the slides back. Thank you very much. Susan, is it everywhere? All right. Here we are. Thank you. We got it. So, there have only been 4 changes in the media environment prior to today that are worth the label revolution. The first one, the most famous perhaps, the rise of the printing press, oil-based inks, all of the things that happened in Gutenberg's shop in the middle of the 1400s. Then, some hundreds of years later, there was a revolution in two-way communications. First the telegraph and then the telephone. Now we have conversational media. I can talk to you and you can talk back to me. We can carry on a conversation. Then, about 150 years ago, there was a string of revolutions in the encoding of media onto physical objects, the encoding of media other than text onto physical objects. First photographs, then sound, then moving images with sound. Right? And finally, about 100 years ago, was the harnessing of radio waves, the harnessing of electromagnetic spectrum to send sound and pictures through the air, radio and television. More like that? All right, sorry. For those of us my age and older, this is the media environment we grew up in. Right? This is what the 20th century was like. All of these 4 media were present in the 20th century, and they basically describe the media landscape of the 20th century. There's a curious asymmetry, though, in that media landscape, which is that the stuff that's good at creating groups is no good at creating conversations, and the stuff that's good at creating conversations is no good at creating groups. Right? I could either take one message and send it to thousands or even millions of people, and that's the way a printing press works. It's also the way a television tower works. It's the same pattern. Or I can have an interactive conversation with one other person. I can call you on the phone, you and I can converse. But there's nothing in the middle. There's nothing in the middle between the two-way, one-to-one pattern and the one-way, one-to-many pattern. Both of those patterns existed, but there wasn't anything bridging it, which is one of the reasons the internet is such a big deal. So this image, which looks like a peacock hit a windscreen, is Bill Cheswick's map of the internet. He maps the various networks that make up the internet and color codes them. And what the internet introduces into the media environment for the first time is a medium that is natively good at supporting group communication. Not just me broadcast to you, and not just you talk to one other person, but really a group that can gather together and have a conversation for itself. So that's one of the big changes, right? We now have a medium that's natively good at many to many. If that was all, that would be a big deal, but it might not yet be a revolution. There's a second big change going on at the same time, however. Consider the difference between a television and a telephone. When you buy a television, the number of consumers of television goes up by 1, but the number of producers of television doesn't budge. Right? The number of producers stays exactly the same. Phones don't work like that. You don't go down to buy a phone and have somebody in the store ask you, do you just want to listen on this phone, or do you want to talk too? Right? You always buy a phone to talk and listen at the same time. It's part of how phones work. For the first time in history, we have a mass medium whose device, the computer, the mobile phone, assumes that everybody wants to consume content and that everybody wants to produce content. Right? It is the scale of television and the logic of the telephone, married for the first time, put together for the first time. So now, every time someone buys a computer or a sufficiently capable mobile phone, the number of consumers of digital media goes up by 1. And the number of producers of digital media also goes up by 1. That's the effect that's leading to the great expanse and expressive capability. Every time someone plugs into the world of television, the amount of content does not change at all. Every time someone plugs into a digital network, on the other hand, the number of creators increases with the number of consumers. And the third change, right, in addition to a many-to-many pattern and symmetrical production and consumption, the third change is this, which is all other media is going digital. And as everything gets digitized, as everything from movies to phone calls gets digitized, the internet becomes the logical mode of carriage for all of it. Which means that you can jump from one medium to the next without ever having to change technologies. It's like having a phone that can turn into a radio broadcast station if you press the right buttons. So being able to have small conversations is not new. Being able to have large broadcasts is not new. What is new is being able to go from one to the other, all in the same environment, all at the same time. With those three characteristics, and that's one of the things I think that makes this a revolution, which is the difference between the previous media landscape and this media landscape is so enormous. With those three characteristics in place, what we start to see isn't just new media producers coming in and competing with existing media producers, although we see that. We also see people producing media for reasons that they never used to produce media. Back when public media was expensive media, you had a small group of professionals creating everything, whether it was movies or television shows or books or magazines. But when the cost of something falls enough, you actually open up the media environment to people who have different motivations than the professionals have. Which is to say, amateur media producers are not just little bitty, sloppy professionals. They're doing a different kind of thing. So here's an example of that. Here somewhere is an example of that. So this is the heading of a website, a weblog called Gnarly Kitty. And Alisara Chirapongse, the woman who runs this, at the time of this story, this is from back in 2006, was a fashion student. in Bangkok. And Gnarly Kitty was her blog, and she would blog about the kinds of things one would blog about if you were a fashion student in Bangkok. So here's one of her posts. This post reads in full. The title of the post is Gone Fishing. And the post reads in full, "No, for real, these last few days, my fingers have been glued to my iPhone, thumbing my way through Flick Fishing." Flick Fishing being an iPhone app for pretending you're fishing when you're really not. So why would anybody post that? Why would you bother to put that up? And the answer is, she's not talking to us. She's talking to her friends. Right? Any day of the week, you could go down to the mall, you could find a group of teenagers hanging out, and they'd be saying things to each other at least this banal. But in that situation, it's clear that you're the weird one. Because what are you doing hanging around listening to the teenagers? We have, for the first time, media that's in public, but not for the public. Which is to say, Chirapongse is broadcasting things to her friends because they're the people who will care about what she's doing. She's just doing it in a medium that we can all happen to get access to. In the 20th century, and really from the 1500s, so for half a millennium, the logic of the media environment has been, why? Why publish this? Right? Why take on the expense of printing this book? Why take on the expense of making this movie, making this television show, whatever? Because media was always very expensive and very difficult and very hard to do. And now it's not any of those things. And one of the great disorientations of stuff like Chirapongse posted in this story is that the logic of the media environment now is, why not? Why not post it? If even 3 people in the world will like this, why not put it out there? We're not used to seeing things that are in public but not for the public, but we better get used to it, because that is the bulk of what's being produced. It's people talking to each other and not really caring who listens in, but also not working to make us happy because we're not her intended audience. So a lot of people seeing this effect have said, oh, I get it. All these amateurs, they're making stuff that's, it's self-amusement, but it doesn't really matter. Right? This kind of media doesn't really matter. These kind of producers don't really matter. It's not that simple, and here's why. One day, Chirapongse wakes up, and there's been a coup in Thailand. And the Thai military goes to the various heads of the Thai media environment, the Thai famously polite people. The military says, please don't report anything about the coup. So no, here goes the music on the radio, nobody's saying anything, nobody knows what's going on, all anybody knows is that there's a coup in Thailand. But the Thai military has not really figured out about the blogosphere yet. So although the media's shut down, the traditional media shut down, the blogs are not. And Chirapongse grabs her camera phone, and she's one of the first people to take pictures of tanks in front of Government House in Bangkok. She puts them up on her blog. She starts to get comments, people come in, this is what I'm seeing, this is what you're seeing. She gets picked up and translated by Global Voices, which is the website, Ethan Zuckerman and Rebecca McKinnon's website for translating posts in the global blogosphere. And all of a sudden the whole world is pouring in. Anybody who wants to know about the Thai coup is now going to Kitty Chirapongse. Right? And she's taking things in her comments, and she's telling people what she knows, and other people are telling what they know. And she suddenly got the attention of this huge audience. She hasn't turned into a journalist, but she has committed an act of journalism, which is to say, in her normal day, she's suddenly done something of global significance. So the coup, right, that particular coup, drags on for a while. It becomes kind of the new normal. Life doesn't change much, except that there's all the kind of political wrangling going on. And so one day, Chirapongse posts this. It's about her Hello Kitty phone, or rather, a phone she got that she didn't like. It was in that kind of mannish black color. She said, that's not the phone I want. She gets out her copy of Photoshop. This is the phone I want. I wish it was pink. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little Hello Kitty up there. on the phone. You can imagine what the comments on this were like. Get back to the coup, right? We don't care about your phone, right? Tell us what's going on with the coup in Thailand. And she puts up one of the great posts, for my money, one of the great posts in the history of the blogosphere, which is Life Like This. And Life Like This begins, okay, first of all, let me clarify some stuff. Right? So when that's the first line, you know you're getting wound up for a rant. Right? And quite a rant it is. She says essentially, this is my blog. Right? And I'm here to write about stuff that's happening in my life. And one of the things that's happening in my life is that there's been a coup in my country. But one of the things that's happening in my life is I want a new phone. And if you don't like it, leave. There's no professional media outlet in the world that would see its audience go up 100-fold and then tell the new users to buzz off. But Chirapongse isn't a little bitty professional media outlet. She's an amateur in the deepest sense of the word. She's doing this because she loves it. And she's not going to have other people come in and tell her how to do her blogging. So what we're seeing in the media landscape isn't just an explosion of new forms. It's also an explosion of new motivations. Because for the first time, people are creating media that gets distributed globally to large audiences. And they're doing it not only for no money, they're doing it for no reason that's even attached to money. It's not like they wish they could be a newspaper. There's a different set of motivations at work here, and those motivations are transforming the environment. Here's that same observation now made entirely diagrammatically. Right? This is the media landscape of the 20th century. An organization in the center, broadcasting information to the edges. One of the things traditional media companies have gotten used to is that the idea that those red arrows can now be reversed. Right? Oh, the audience can talk back to us. Our listeners, our consumers can talk back to us. And mostly that thought frightens them. So they figure out ways to get people to talk back in ways that don't matter much, like let's vote for which singer is best in a singing contest, rather than anything else. But that's not where the freakouts are coming from. Here's where the freakouts are coming from. The stuff that's really different about this media environment is that the people formerly known as the audience can now reach each other directly, conversationally, no professionals anywhere in sight. And there are way more green lines than red lines. And that's not about technology, that's not about tools, that's just math. That's just the way networks work. So when I talk about the difference between professional and amateur motivations, part of it is about individual behaviors, but part of it is about group behavior. Because in the center here, right, traditional organizations, right, that's where management lies. That's where there's a small enough group, it's tightly enough coordinated that you can make managerial decisions. Right? But out here, out in the world where we are, right? And the idea that some group of us may want to come together and mail pink underwear to somebody as a political protest. You're not going to get there with management. So what works out here, what's happening out here in this outside ring, is really culture. Right? Culture is the thing that coordinates people who aren't being managed. And it is up to us in a way that's partly about decisions, but that's mostly about just the way we choose to live our lives, what kind of culture we're going to get. Here's an example that I think fuses those two patterns, the pattern of individual motivation, Kitty Chirapongse, and of global culture. End of 2007, Kenya, there was an election in Kenya, and the election unearthed ethnic tensions in the country. And there was a spate of horrific post-election violence. And there was a Kenyan blogger who blogs under the name Kenyan Pundit, Ori Akola. And Ori put something on her blog saying, tell me what's going on, right? We all know that there's violence out there. But the problem is what each individual citizen knows isn't enough to see the pattern. We have to be able to know what the group knows. So people took her up on it. And they started posting things in the comments on Kenyan Pundit. I just witnessed this, in my town that has happened. And Ori couldn't keep up. There was so much material flooding in that she couldn't keep up with it. She could have been at her computer 24 hours a day. And she couldn't have integrated all the information she was getting, and she would have fallen over after a while. So she said, I need a tool. I need a tool to help. I can't do this by myself. 2 programmers came forward and said, we'll build it for you. 2 days later, they launched a piece of software called Ushahidi, which means witness in Swahili. And Ushahidi takes SMS messages or web messages with locations, and it puts them on a map. And suddenly you can start to see what everybody knows. You can take all of the aggregate bits of tacit knowledge of the individual citizens and you can turn it into a map you can look at. Patrick Meyer up at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative did a study of various bits of media coverage of the violence in Kenya. And what he found was that Ushahidi was earliest to report violence. Because whereas the mainstream media would only report violence that ended in large-scale fatalities, Ushahidi would report attacks that hadn't ended in fatalities, or attacks that had ended in one fatality. And you could see a pattern, right? Where if you knew the places where violence was ramping up, you could know where the larger problems were coming. And so Ushahidi not only lets people aggregate information, it also creates an environment where you can better predict the future because you're picking up on the weak signals. You're picking up on what everybody knows, not just what anybody knows. So this is developed in Kenya, early part of 2008. But of course, although Akola has asked for this for the particular Kenyan circumstance, the programmers have made something that has general capability. This thing takes tacit knowledge and puts it on a map. So Ushahidi has now spread all over, right? It was used in Mexico to track reports of voting fraud. More recently, it was deployed first in Haiti, and then in Chile, right? To track a whole host of things. Oh, sorry, it's cut off over here. But it tracks injuries, it tracks deaths, it tracks need for equipment, it tracks location of equipment. It uses the simplest technology, the simplest digital technology people have, which is the SMS on the phone, and it turns it into tacit knowledge. And it's done this globally. We were talking this morning about cities, and someone asked what I thought the outcome of this conference might be. And I said that the outcome was almost certainly going to be among the lateral connections drawn among the attendees, people you meet and talk to, rather than any kind of top-down plan. Ushahidi is a perfect example of that. It has now become almost normal. In a little over a year, it's become almost normal in situations where there is a crisis like this to ask, could we deploy Ushahidi here to collect information from the cities? And to have a piece of software that gets built in 2 days from one blogger's call and turns into a bit of global humanitarian infrastructure was pretty remarkable. And it's not a way of working we could have had even 5 years ago. So a lot of what is happening now is this ability to start thinking about what would you do if you got a group together. We have as a legacy, both in the language and the design of the digital tools we use, the notion of personal, right? It's the personal computer. This is for you. But in fact, once you connect the computers together, once you connect the phones together, right, it takes on this social characteristic as well. which is to say, what's the most valuable thing attached to your computer isn't your screen or your printer or your mouse. The most valuable thing attached to your computer is you. And the ability to aggregate dozens or thousands or millions of yous into something larger is the characteristic of these networks. Now, we've had the internet for 40 years. We've had mobile telephony longer than that. Why is it just in the last decade that the social effects have been really profound, and in the last 3 years really beginning to be world-shaping? These tools don't become socially interesting until they become technologically boring. It's not the moment that a shiny new tool appears that it matters. It's the moment where your mom takes it for granted. Right? When email becomes so normal that nobody even thinks of it as techie anymore, right? That's when these tools start to matter. And so, although we've had the capabilities, the raw digital capabilities for some time, what's changing now is that people are instead of thinking about the tools, they're starting to think with them. We've got a problem with violence in Kenya. What can we do? Right? And that ability to use these tools to coordinate social value, right, is something that isn't embedded in the tool itself. If I invented a great new shovel, you all would not rush out to dig more ditches. Because merely having the technological capability to do something isn't enough to get that thing to happen. What makes something happen is having the opportunity and the motivation at the same time. And very often we're seeing new opportunities meet ancient motivations. Motivations to come together, to share things, to work together, to make life better. And it's when those two things at the same time happen that things really change. So here's an example of social aggregation at a scale much larger even than Shirky. Wikipedia, certainly in the English language, the most famous large aggregation of digital work. And Wikipedia, enormous, right? Millions of articles, millions of people working on it. It's in many languages. This is the Wikipedia article for Doctor Who, which is the British science fiction television show. And if you know anything about the sort of Wikipedia user base, you'd be able to guess that this article is really good. It's been, it's incredibly detailed, it's incredibly thorough. It's been edited thousands of times by thousands of users. It is a compendium of the kind of shared knowledge of this subject. Now this is true for any large-scale Wikipedia article, thousands of edits, thousands of users. And you'll hear a lot of speculation about bottom-up, self-organized, the hive mind. But when you stop to ask what those words are telling you, they're really not telling you much. Self-organized doesn't really mean very much. IBM is self-organized on some level. Right? So in a way, those words are just labels for the mystery, which is, how do groups of people coordinate to do something like that when it's clearly not their job, and they're clearly not being managed to do it? So if you go and look at the history of how these articles come together, right, what you see, as I said, in this case, almost 9,000 edits, over 3,000 contributors. So on average, each contributor has contributed between 2 and 3 articles. But here's the funny thing. The average is meaningless in this system. There is no average user. So here is a graph of every user who's edited the Doctor Who article, ranked in order by the number of edits they've made. And we do not see a hive mind. We do not see bottom-up development. We do not see everybody comes in and kicks in their 2 or 3 edits and the whole thing kind of decreases. What we see instead is that over here, the most active user, Chaos Works, has edited the article nearly 1,000 times on his own. One person has done over a quarter of the work. And 2/3 of the users, 2/3 of the contributors, have contributed only one edit once, ever, and then left. Okay? So these people, the 2,200, they're not members of a community around this Doctor Who article in any meaningful sense. Meanwhile, these people over here have done an enormous preponderance of it. Now, if you were a business, right, it's easy to see what to do about this. Imagine hiring someone who does one piece of work, and then for the rest of their employment just sits around the break room, drinking your Cokes and eating candy. Bad hire. Not a great employee. But here's the thing, Wikipedia doesn't have employees. So if you want to come by and fix one typo on an article and then leave and I never see you again, fine. Because the article is that one typo better. So the trick here is not to think, oh, we only want to hire these people, the classic management idea, just hire the people doing most of the work. The trick is to think about the whole ecosystem. Because it is these people and these people working together that's making all of this work. A question was asked this morning in one of the morning sessions on cities, what do you do about coordinating large groups? And the answer is almost always, inside every large collaborative effort is a small collaborative effort that's actually driving things. This article, and this is again true across the whole range of Wikipedia articles, this article would fall apart if there weren't a small group of people who cared much more than average that this article be good. Because it is that small group within the larger ecosystem that's keeping the thing on an even keel. And that is this person in this particular case. This is the user page for ChaosWorks. ChaosWorks is the person who's done nearly 1,000 edits on his own. And here's a list of ChaosWorks contributions. That's a Wikipedia page, that's another, that's another. And then each of these are sections that ChaosWorks has edited on that Wikipedia page. You can start to see a theme arising for ChaosWorks interest. We also know a bunch of other things about him. Attended college in London, has a Bachelor of Law degree, has an MA in American history, lives in Hong Kong. This is a thoroughly improbable individual. Right? Imagine the BBC, which owns Doctor Who, going and trying to get one of the directors of the BBC to say that they're going to let the fans edit a compendium of Doctor Who information. The BBC's question would be, won't that be chaotic, right? Won't the users come in and just make a mess of things? And you could say, well, there's going to be this one person, see, who steps forward and does the huge bulk of the kind of steering committee work that's needed, who does the huge bulk of the work that's needed to make this article good. To which you can imagine someone at the BBC asking, I didn't know about that person, who is it? To which you would have to say, I don't know yet. Right? The astonishing thing about Wikipedia articles is there's always, for large-scale articles, there's always a small group of people who do most of the work. And nobody knows in advance who they are. It's like what we know from living in large cities. Right? Large cities make improbable events probable because the number of people involved mean that even if something is unlikely in an individual instance, it's very likely as a group. I worked at a pizza place in the Midwest when I was a teenager. And I went to New York when I was 16, and I saw pizza by the slice. And I'd never seen that before. Because we didn't make pizza by the slice in the Midwest. There weren't enough people around. You had to know who wanted pizza before you made some pizza. In New York, you could make a pizza. And the chance that any given person walking down the street will want a slice of your pizza is about this big. But New York is about this big. So this much of a chance times this much population means that the improbable people show up. Wikipedia is the pizza by the slice principle writ large. Right? The improbable individuals, the people who make these articles good, show up over and over and over again, even when people can't know in advance who they are. Here's another example. This one much more directly related to the world of business, because this isn't an either-or proposition. This is really a question of hybridization. This is Howard Forums. Howard Forums is the go-to site for cell phone geeks, for mobile phone geeks. And Howard Forums is Howard Forums for the same reason that Craigslist is Craigslist, which is it was started by Howard. Howard Chewy was blogging about mobile phones in 2000, when not many people were blogging, and of the people blogging, not many were blogging about mobile phones. And so other people started to find his blog and come in and ask questions. Right? Oh, can you tell me how to do this thing? I've got a Samsung phone and I'm doing it on the Verizon network. And Howard would always say, I don't have that phone, I'm not using that network, I can't answer your question. But the questions kept coming because people wanted this information. And so he had the inspired thought to say, I can't help you people, but you can help each other. Here's a bulletin board, go talk to each other. Right? Because I can't deal with you. I'll just set myself up as the moderator. So this is how it forms. It's going to do 1 billion page views this year with a paid staff of 2. Right? And it is broken down one collection of conversations for every carrier, tens of thousands of posts, hundreds of thousands of responses. Right? And it gets pretty geeky in there. There's a post on how to put a custom ringtone on a Samsung T509, which does a shot-by-shot screenshot of this is exactly how you do it. You wish Samsung would give you instructions this good, right? But it's the amateur stuff that actually looks like it was made by professionals. Howard Forums has gotten so good that engineers inside carriers and mobile phone handset manufacturers will sometimes send their own customers to Howard Forums to have their questions answered. So that seems crazy. What can a bunch of amateurs have that trained engineers inside technology companies don't have? And the amateurs here have the same thing we all have, which is we have access to reality. We're the only people living out in the real world where we're trying to make this phone do that thing on that network. No one can model the full complexity of the world inside one organization. And so by aggregating what everybody on Howard Forums knows, right, one customer knows much less than one engineer, but many customers know much more. And it is that ability, again, new to our historical generation, to do that kind of aggregate. Now, custom Samsung T509 instructions isn't the only thing that happens on Howard Forum. There's also a sort of collection of miscellaneous, a MISC bulletin board, including post pictures of your pets, right? So you get stuff like this. Oh, cute. Took a picture of my cat with my camera phone and now I want to share it with my friends. And it's very easy in a business context to figure out how to make Howard Forums better, right? You just want less of this and more of that. But imagine what would happen if Howard himself went in and said, okay, knock it off with the cats. Right? All I want is documentation of putting custom ringtones on your Samsung and things like that. This is about cell phones. Don't talk to each other about anything else. Can you imagine how that would go over? Not so good. Because these people aren't employees. Right? The cats and the instructions actually come from the same motivation, which is here. I've got something I want to share with you. I think you'll like it. And that motivation, the human motivation to do things on your own, is the thing that's driving Howard Forums. Howard Forums would be worse if they got rid of the pictures of the cute cats. Now this flies in the face of a lot of what we believe about motivation. Right? A lot of what we believe about motivation is that motivation is additive. People can simply be motivated to do things in all kinds of ways, and all we need to do is add up enough motivation that they'll that they'll be willing to do it. But that's not actually how humans work. And the first real piece of evidence that this was going to be, that the world of motivation was actually going to be subdivided, came about as a result of this. This is a toy called Soma. It's a wooden block. As you can see, it's 3 squares on an edge. And it disassembles into these 7 pieces, right, which have characteristic shapes, unique shapes. There's one and only one way it can assemble back into a cube. And you can also use the shape to build a bunch of other combinations. And in 1970, a guy named Ed Deasy took this cube, and he took 24 undergraduates, and one at a time he brought them into a room and said, I'm going to give you a Soma cube, and I'm going to give you some of these diagrams, and I want to see how many of these shapes you can make in the next hour. So the undergraduates were working away on the shapes, trying to assemble them. And Deasy was making a great show of taking notes. And then he'd say at the end, okay, that was great, thanks. Just wait here. I got to go in my office and enter some stuff in the computer. I'll be right back. And the students thought the experiment had ended, but in fact it had just begun. Deasy would leave the room, go behind a one-way mirror, and watch the students for exactly 8 minutes. And he wanted to see, were they going to keep playing with the cubes? And on average, for about 4 of the 8 minutes, they kept playing with the cubes. They'd gotten interested in it, and they found it engaging to play with the cube. So the next week, same students, same experiment, absolutely identical with one change. 12 of those 24 undergraduates were paid to make the cubes. I'll give you $1 for every shape you can make. And this is back when $1 actually meant something to a college student. And lo and behold, the people who were being paid worked more on the cubes during the break, right? Because they now saw the cubes as a source of income. And if I get better at this, I can earn some money. Third week, Deasy runs exactly the same experiment, same students, again, and again, like the first week, nobody's getting paid. The group of people who'd never been paid kept playing with the cubes. The group of people who'd been paid the previous week stopped playing with the cubes. Having been paid, they'd lost interest in the activity in and of itself. In fact, the amount of time they spent on the cubes, playing with the cubes on their own, fell by twice as much as it had gone up when they're paid. So Deasy was the first person to say, intrinsic motivations, things we're doing for the love of it, are different from extrinsic motivations. Different from being paid, different from this is my job, different from my boss says I have to do this. And in 1970, this was a shock. Right? In the psychological world, the thought was, people do things for motivations, and those motivations are additive. So if someone likes an activity and also you pay them to do it, that'll just be even better. What Deasy said is no. Intrinsic motivations and extrinsic motivations are different. And if you add extrinsic motivations to something people like doing, they actually like it less. So one of the things we're seeing as we see this rise of amateur participation in the media landscape is that there's a difference between the Howard Forums model of people doing things out of a sense of autonomy and competence, they're good at it, and also of membership and generosity, of liking to share in social situations, that cannot be trivially converted to commercial models. Another example. In 2004, SARS broke out, sudden acute respiratory syndrome. It was a fast-spreading disease, and the race was on to sequence SARS, to find a cure, and to get, first, before finding the cure, to get a genetic sequence. So, shortly after the worst of the outbreaks in China, a little outfit called the Genome Sciences Center in Western Canada announced that they had produced the sequence, the genetic sequence for SARS. They announced that they published it. They'd done the whole thing in less than a month. And it was an incredible bit of biological detective work. And that was great. But the funny thing is or the puzzle there is, why wasn't it China? China, right, had the disease first. They had more cases. They had more samples. They had a much bigger incentive than any other country in the world to get it right. No slouches in the thinking department. They have excellent biochemists, excellent computer scientists, excellent research facilities, and they didn't sequence the SARS virus. It was the folks in Canada. So there was a remarkable article in May of that year by Henry Yang Hongmen, in China, saying, I was there. I was in a biological research lab in Beijing. And what we lacked wasn't incentive, and it wasn't expertise. What we lacked was sharing. The only way to take on a job this complicated is for people to share their resources, and the Chinese government wouldn't let us share. Every time we turned around, we had to ask for permission to share one sample or another. Meanwhile, there was a write-up of the Canadian work in the Linux Journal. And what you see reading that is that the Genome Sciences Center, their advantage was that they were too small to believe they could do the whole thing by themselves. So that every place in the system where they could involve someone else, they did. They ran on open source software, they ran on Linux, they used open source biological tools, they checked data in and out of publicly accessible databases, because they recognized that taking advantage of the other work that had already been done was going to be the way to fix this problem as quickly as possible. And as the information, as the possibility of this kind of collaboration on the global scale increases, the competition we're seeing isn't so much between rich and poor or large and small. Not even so much between fast and slow as it is between open and closed, or able to share and not able to share. The ability to involve other people quickly and at low cost was the thing that ended up seeing the SARS virus sequence. Not incentive, not brain power, not resources. The ability to leverage brain power and resources from other places. That's an example of the cultural shift that I think is in front of us. As I said earlier in the talk, the large, unmanaged group of citizens, of the people formerly known as the audience, of us, we can't act like a business. We can't act like a government. We're too diverse in our needs and interests and behaviors. So how do we coordinate with one another, right, in ways that produce benefit or value without having to take on the overhead of management? And the answer is cultural change. Now, some of the cultural change is already happening, and it's happening just as a side effect of our adopting these tools. But the most important cultural changes, the kind of cultural changes that led the Genome Sciences Center to be the first to sequence the SARS virus, have to do with actually making a conscious decision to change the way they work, and possibly to make a decision to try and change the way other people work or live as well. Here's an example of that. It's one of the things that's going on in the States right now that I'm most interested in because it's such a dramatic move. There's a site called Patients Like Me, and the idea behind Patients Like Me is that it is difficult to cure rare diseases, in part because it's difficult simply to get enough people together to run a legitimate test of drugs or therapies. So the idea behind Patients Like Me is we will just gather together everybody suffering from a particular disease, and it will make it easier for researchers to find the test patients they need, to test therapies, to learn things. So at this point, there's a ALS, sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease in the United States. It's a disease of atrophying of the muscles. Patients Like Me now gets one new member with ALS for every 10 diagnoses. They've assembled the largest collection of ALS sufferers ever in the history of the world. And down at the level of individual detail, right, here is a user, slow motion movie, a male, 47 years old, lives in Atlanta. Right? Suffering from bipolar illness, manic depressive, right? Putting up really specific information about what is causing him distress, about how bad the distress is, how well or badly he can function. And although he hasn't exactly given his street address here, right? Given the amount of other information, if I had to go around looking for 47-year-old males in Atlanta, Georgia, I could probably find this person with a little work. This flies in the face of US culture around medical data. We have right now a culture that says it's very, very private. Medical data is very, very private. You must never let anyone but your doctor see it. Patients like me can't work, cannot work in that culture. But they know that. So not only do they have a privacy policy, they have what they call an openness philosophy, and I'm sorry it's a little cut off there. They specifically make the argument to every user who signs up, it will be good for you and good for the world if you share information that the world is currently telling you to keep private. If you share your medical details, everybody will get better faster because research will be able to proceed more rapidly, at lower cost, with higher accuracy. But to get those good effects, we have to not just ignore the culture of the current healthcare industry. We have to undo it. We have to reverse it. If all that Patients Like Me does is puts together panels of patients that happen to help a handful of pharmaceutical companies make money, they will have failed. Right? They have in mind nothing less than altering the culture of disease. They want to make having a disease not be something shameful, not be something you hide, but something you share, in order to bring to the medical establishment a lot of the same kinds of values you can see in other stories here, from the Association of Loose and Forward Pub-Going Women to Wikipedia. I don't know if they'll succeed or not. It is an enormous hurdle they have set for themselves. But it is one of the most aggressive and noble attempts I know of to take what the tools make natively possible, which is widespread sharing, and to match it with a set of cultural norms that will make our lives better, but which can only operate in the face of the existing culture. I find myself in the sad position of teaching my own youth as ancient history. And one of the hardest things to convey to 25-year-olds about the web is how crazily contingent it all was. Right? From their point of view, the web was always going to be a good idea. Wikipedia was always going to work. Linux was always going to run the world's servers, and so on. And I have to try to explain to them that we really didn't know what was going to work and what wasn't. And that the things that started out, when they started out, didn't seem important. They got important, but they didn't start important. So I have a slide I put up for them, and I will put it up for you. Oh, sorry, thank you. Wrong slide. There we go. Slide I put up for them that I will put up for you. The top sentence is from Linus Torvalds' first message to Usenet about what became Linux in 1991. The bottom sentence is from Larry Sanger's first message to the Newpedia mailing list, a mailing list about digital encyclopedias, about what became Wikipedia. And the remarkable thing to me about these things is how modest they are. Right? Linus doesn't say, we're going to take on Microsoft in the server market. Right? Sanger doesn't say, we're going to drive Encyclopedia and Carta out of business. These are both just invitations to experimentation. Sanger doesn't say, we're going to create a giant, globally important reference word. Sanger says, humor me. Let's try this. Let's just see if we can make this work. And if I'd given you every message written on Usenet that day, or every piece of public email on a mailing list on the day Wikipedia was launched, no one could have picked out that message, this Torvalds guy. That's the important message of that day. When Linus launched Linux, he had 6 people helping him. That was it. That's where the revolution got started. There's one in Norway, there's one in Austria, there's one in San Jose, there's one in New Zealand. It was a tiny global organization. It sounds strange to our ears. We're used to global meaning the next step after really big. But actually global is about physical space, not size. So you can have tiny global organizations. Linux was the first tiny global organization I know of using these kinds of techniques. And this happens over and over again. This is from 1991, this is from 2001. Here's 2006, right? Twitter, the 100 million strong short message system now being used to tweet messages about this. This is how Twitter got started. This was it. It wasn't, we want to make life difficult for the world's dictators. It wasn't, we want to give Ashton Kutcher a platform for reaching millions of people. This was all it was. If you'd seen all the business ideas launched on that particular day, you would not have picked this sentence out as the thing that was going to get to 100 million users in 5 years. And that is, I think, the key observation about all of the examples I've used so far. There are very few rules. There is no recipe for getting this right, alas. Right? One of the real commonalities across this whole range of examples is the stuff that's big and good today started small and good, and people worked to make it better, instead of starting big and boring and having people work to make it good. And that ability to start small and good and have people work to make it bigger, right, is the characteristic of small-scale experimentation. So people want the recipe. They want to know what is the right way to ensure that we can do something with social media that will succeed. And the answer is you can't. Right? We're really at a moment where the answer for this stuff is constant experimentation. We still are in a world of special cases. We know some of what works, we know some of what doesn't, but most of it is unexplored. And I think that a lot of the most important experimentation that comes out is going to be about not just using new tools, but changing the culture around those tools at the same time. And there I'll end. Thank you very much.